Thank you very much once again, Mr. Murphy, and please do stay tuned. Welcome back to Conversations, where we're pleased to welcome to the program now Phillip Agee. Welcome to Conversations. Welcome back to the United States, if I may say so.
Thank you very much.
And Phillip Agee, of course, is an ex-CIA agent, or a person involved with the CIA who's seen the light and changed his view of things and got into considerable personal difficulty with the United States over the years. And I wonder if maybe you could, Phillip, just for some of the people who might not be directly familiar with it, your history. You were a member of the CIA, you were working as a CIA operative and so forth. Maybe
yes.
Share your own history, your own personal background.
Well, it goes back quite some years now. I was finishing my undergraduate studies at the University of Notre Dame in 1956 when the CIA came around and asked me if I would go into what they considered to be their most important training program, the way they would bring in the future executive leadership of the agency. And as I was going on to study law at that moment, I rejected the recruitment approach. But then about a year later, I was about to be drafted. It was when we still had compulsory military services. Yeah, and so I wrote off to the CIA because they had told me that if I hadn't done my military service, I could do it within this training program. And so I wrote back, and 6 months later I was in the CIA. And they sent me off to military training, basic training, and then officer candidate school. I was commissioned a second lieutenant, worked for a year as an intelligence officer in the Air Force, and then was transferred back to Washington. Went through the year-long training program there, and by the end of 1960, before 1960 was out, at age 25, I was down in South America running secret operations as a CIA officer undercover as a U.S. diplomat in the U.S. Embassy. Having received a fairly good education in the process and the standards and the rigorous standards that they set, or... You know, that's an interesting... Am I correct? You think in terms of the foreign services being a very high calling, and you think of other services, but the quality of the people that they bring to that CIA activity, is it a high calling? Is it something like... Well, I would say in terms of the background and the conventional education, certainly very high. They took in about 50 to 55 people a year for this training program. Yeah, and that's not very many. Not at all. And the problem was that I left university with an honors degree in philosophy, but with no education. No political education, is what I'm trying to say. And I didn't get a political education until I got down to Latin America. And I saw the realities of the situation down there. And little by little I came to understand that the things that I was doing was not really in the security interests of the United States. Rather, they were there for, or we were doing all these things for stability. And here I'm talking about propping up friends, political parties, interfering in elections, establishing trade unions, putting out literature of all sorts, of funding radio stations, all of what is known as covert action operations. And these are all based on the collection of intelligence, and then you use the intelligence to try to manipulate events in a foreign country. The end result was that we were seeking stability by propping up the traditional ruling classes of those countries, meaning what they call down there the oligarchies. These are the few families that over the many generations have been able to corner most of the wealth and income and the land in those countries. And so I gradually turned against the work, and eventually, after 8 years in Latin America, quit. But at that time, it was 1968 by then, I had no intention of writing a book. I was simply going to stay in Mexico and start a new life. I went to work with the company there, people I had met already when I was in the CIA, and I also re-enrolled in university. I went into a doctoral program in the National University of Mexico on Latin American history and culture and so forth. I thought maybe I might come back to the States to teach at one point. But about a year or year and a half after I had left the CIA, all those old pressures of secrecy and discipline and security consciousness had begun to fade away. And as they faded, I began to think what had previously been unthinkable, and no one had ever done it before, that is to write a book about how the CIA operates abroad. All the different types of operations, but with real operations. I'm describing what I and my colleagues had been doing. Well, I tried to start that book in Mexico, and I couldn't get the documentation I needed because I didn't have everything in my memory.
Yeah.
So, to make a long story short, I left Mexico, went to Paris, then went on to London, and 5 years after I had started, I had the book finished. And that is the book which is known as Inside the Company,
Yes,
CIA
right.
Diary.
Yes, right.
It was first published in Britain in order to avoid censorship in the States, and then it came out in, I think, now 29 languages.
Yeah, amazing. And what year did that come out then?
First came out in 1975, and it's still coming out.
Yeah, it's still coming out, and it's still a box of that because you're showing that. I wonder if we could back up a little bit. One goes to the CIA, and you think of many friends I have, or friends and acquaintances who had worked with the OSS at the Second War, and the growth of the intelligence capability of the United States, which many of the people feel they were serving good purpose when they were involved in that. Do you understand what I'm saying? And intelligence is important, government need information and so forth. When, if we have, did something change that put the United States into a position which seems now to be using covert action, this kind of intelligence gathering, to only prop up oligarchy governments? When did the United States go wrong, if they did, and why did the covert action and the work of the CIA become so important in terms of our foreign policy initiatives in view of the world, in your estimation? If you understand the transition I'm trying to see between the end of the Second War and that kind of thing.
Yes, it's easy. We could talk about this for hours, you know. But I think it really, if you want to put your finger on a particular moment, it's the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, which began the establishment, excuse me, signals the establishment of the national security state in this country. And it grows out of economic problems after World War II, which were anticipated even before the war was over, which led to the Marshall Plan for reconstruction of Western Europe, which was unsuccessful. Most people think the Marshall Plan was a great success. In fact, it was a failure. And it required the military option taken in 1950 to remilitarize both the United States and Western Europe, with West Germany and the other NATO countries, but especially West Germany as the hub. It was the so-called dollar gap period in which there weren't enough dollars in Western Europe to buy exports from the United States to prop up the economy here.
You say the Marshall Plan was a failure?
It was indeed a failure.
Most people did not see it that way.
No, most people, the common interpretation is there was great success.
And I probably would have thought it was a great success until you mentioned it.
I can refer to you to some very interesting studies. Among others, the classic book which came out in the late 60s about this period, which is called The Limits of Power. It's written by Gabriel and Joyce Colco. They are professors in Canada, and it is the story of the first 10 years. And they explode all these myths like the Marshall Plan. And in any case, the decision was taken in 1950 to increase the military budget many times over, and it got us on a national security militaristic footing. The CIA was part of that. And the CIA, from the very beginning, was not used just to collect intelligence. That's what one feels that an intelligence service should do. Collect information, process the information, and then present it to the policymakers like the President, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, for their decisions.
Yeah, but they got doing policy things, they're setting policy themselves and carrying it out.
Well, in actual fact, at the very first meeting of the National Security Council in 1947, after the bill was passed and signed by Truman, and Truman was in the chair at this meeting, the decision was taken to set aside $10 million for secret CIA intervention in the upcoming Italian elections, which were scheduled for April 1948. $10 million, a huge amount of money in those days.
Yes.
And this money was set aside because there was fear that a left-wing coalition of socialists, communists, and others would win the first elections in Italy after liberation in 1944 from fascism. The reason was that these political forces had been the backbone of the resistance to more than 20 years of fascism in Italy.
Right, all right.
And so they came out of the war very strong.
Yes,
And the fear was that they might win these first elections. So the money was passed out, these $10 million, through front organizations in Italy, through the Vatican, through Italian-American organizations in this country, and the result was that the Christian Democrats, that is the far right, the conservatives, won the elections. And that wasn't the end of it. Over the next 30 years, more than $100 million went to the Christian Democratic Party of Italy.
Just in Italy alone.
To keep them in power, exactly.
So the die was cast in terms of...
Exactly. As late as 1976, President Ford approved $6 or $8 million to the Christian Democrats for the elections that were scheduled for June of 1976. So you see, it's a continuing thing. And it wasn't just Italy, but the euphoria after the 1948 election operation in Italy led to the creation of the bureaucratic structure to repeat this all over the world. And I myself was involved in Latin America.
Yeah, you were one of those that had been recruited to carry this out.
That's right. And so this is what you have the CIA doing from the very beginning. And I am very strong about, or feel strongly about, the point that the United States needs an intelligence service. But the United States, we need an intelligence service that keeps the peace, not one that is used to wage terrorist war against defenseless peasants in Central America. And that is the way the Reagan administration, and now the Bush administration is threatening to continue, has been using the CIA, but it's not anything new to them, because also starting in 1947 there were paramilitary operations against every country of Eastern Europe. They were the Contras of that period. Absolute failure. Those operations went on at least from 1947 until 1955, and not one of them succeeded because the U.S. side, the forces that we recruited, trained, and dispatched were like the Contras. They had absolutely no political base. They had no popularity. The people in the late 40s and early 50s had served in the Nazi puppet regimes of the occupied countries of Eastern Europe during World War II. And with the retreat of the German forces, these people came with the Germans, and they ended up after the war in displaced persons camps, many of them. And that's where the CIA screened them, selected them, recruited them, trained them, and then dispatched them through so-called black overflights or maritime infiltrations to try to carry out sabotage, terrorism, foment rebellion, that kind of thing, just like the Contras had been doing in the 1980s in Nicaragua. So all of these things begin at the beginning, back in the 1940s, and they are continuous, and all 42 years of the existence of the CIA. So you have the attempt to penetrate and manipulate the institutions of power of other countries through covert interventions, known as covert action operations or special activities. And this is the subversion, really, of so-called pluralistic democratic institutions, because obviously, to the degree that a foreign political party or a trade union or a media institution like a newspaper are controlled by foreign power, i.e. the CIA and the United States, to that degree they're not free at all. And it's all done with money and with people who've been corrupted, paid salaries and so forth.
And that influence is becoming and growing stronger all the time around the world in the third world countries of the world?
That has been the attempt. The goal has been control. That's the bottom line. Control is a word that every CIA trainee learns very early on. It means long-range control of the natural resources, of the labor, and of the markets of foreign countries for the benefit of United States multinational corporations. That's what it comes down to.
And that is defined as the national interest.
That's defined as the national interest. Of course, in order to effect this control, it takes a lot of political repression. Because not only are there these operations to influence elections, or to collect information, or to establish trade unions, or influence the media, even to control it, to finance it, to establish newspapers, for example, or magazines. But there is what are known as liaison operations. This is a form of counterintelligence in which the CIA works with other foreign intelligence and security services all over the world. It started with the British right after World War II, but it expanded all over the world, and the CIA set up subsidiary intelligence services all over the world, beginning, for example, in Greece. You know, the civil war that raged in Greece from 1947 to 1949, we, the United States, intervened militarily on the side of the far right in Greece, which won the war, and in the aftermath the CIA set up the KYP, or KEEP, KYP being the Greek initials for Central Intelligence Agency. They just gave it the same name. And this was the instrument for political repression and control in Greece for many, many years to come, leading up to the fascist coup in Greece in 1967, when the liaison officer of the KEEP, KYP, with the CIA station in Athens, became the leader of the military junta. His name was Colonel George Papadopoulos. And he was the liaison contact with, or principal liaison contact, meaning he was paid a salary, no doubt, by the CIA. Well, they set up the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. And to this day, although it has a different name, this has been the institution for political control and repression in South Korea. And I could go around the world giving you examples. But today, you can be sure, as sure of this as you are of your own name, that the CIA is working every day round the clock with the murderous security and intelligence services of El Salvador, which are the same as the death squads, which have wiped out more than 70,000 people since the U.S. program began in Syria in 1981.
Yeah, right.
70,000 people, and this is one of the principal elements of any counterinsurgency operation. You know that they've been getting more than $1.5 million a day. In these 8 years, they've gotten $3.5 billion.
Yeah, right.
The CIA put millions of dollars into the electoral campaign in 1984 to get Duarte elected, which they succeeded in doing. And the work with the security services in El Salvador is one of the grisliest activities in our day right now.
Yeah. All the while we're preaching anti-terrorism and so forth. We're some of the biggest terrorist operations in the world.
We're fomenting state terrorism all over the place.
How has it been? We had a revolutionary tradition in the United States. We came out of the Second War and into the anti-colonial era without perhaps the same baggage that many of the European countries did vis-a-vis the colonized world and so forth. There was a good deal of reservoir of goodwill, or sense of goodwill or feeling toward the example and the example of the United States, and one wonders where and how we went wrong to where the United States seems now to have gotten itself irrevocably into a position of respecting only oligarchic and stable right-wing governments almost around the world. And how has it been that we've gotten ourselves into that position and unable somehow at a policy level or at a philosophical level, political leadership level, with some system that allows us to relate in some manner or means to the aspirations and the needs of the vast majority of the masses of the people of this planet? Where have we gone wrong, and is that a major problem? We don't have a political philosophy that allows us to relate to the needs of the underclasses of the world.
I think that's been from the beginning, and I would take issue when you say that we had our own revolutionary tradition. I would say, and I think the evidence is overwhelming, that the framers of the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, were this oligarchy we're talking about in other countries. And if they started out as an elite governing body, which they were the bankers, the merchants, the landowners, the lawyers, the slaveholders of colonial society. They were the people with the money, in other words, and they wrote the Constitution to preserve and enhance their own private wealth. They were scared to death of democracy. And there's evidence after evidence. I refer you to, and all the viewers, to a recent book just out a couple of months ago, published by South End Press. It is called Toward an American Revolution. And the author is a professor whose name is Jerry Frizzia. And he takes Charles Beard's earlier analyses and much further applying them to today. And I think, well, when I go to university speaking, and I've spoken at more than 100 places in the last year and a half, I say that that may be the best $10 that any student could ever spend during 4 years of education. Because it explodes the myth, as irreverent as that may be for us Americans. Explodes the myth of the grandeur of the Constitution and of the Founding Fathers, because they were looking at them after themselves. They were scared to death of democracy, of real democracy, and they wrote out of the political process completely all of the indentured laborers, all the men without property, all the Native Americans, they were savages, all the blacks, most of them were slaves, and all of the women. And they started the Constitution, we the people of the United States, and they were less than 10% of the people. Well,
democracy was a new idea in a certain sense in the political frame of reference.
Yes, but it hasn't changed that much, I don't think. You know what we have in the United States today?
What do we
have 2% of the families in this country owning 54% of the net financial assets of the United States.
5% virtually on it all.
Well, I used to think that the concentration of wealth and income in Latin America was a scandal until I began to see what it was in the States, and that figure of 2% owning 54% is not something out of the air. That comes from the Catholic bishops' pastoral on the economy.
And the trending is that it becomes more and more concentrated as you and I sit here and talk.
Well, we've just seen in recent days that during the 8 years of Reaganism, the rich people in the United States have gotten a whole lot richer, and the poor people have gotten a whole lot poorer. And that is why I say that we've never been revolutionary. We've never had the masses of the population under consideration, really. It's been stabilizing the situation, keeping them under control, having escape valves so that poor people can get rich if they're very lucky. But it means that 1 in 3 Americans do not have the slightest chance or hope of ever realizing the American dream. 1 in 3 Americans is illiterate, either totally, or 1 in 3, it's that high. either totally or to the degree that they cannot function in a society based on the written word, such as street signs, for example.
Right.
Read illiteracy in America.
Jonathan Cole.
Exactly.
Kozel, yeah. In a country that is as wealthy as this one is.
It's a disgrace, absolute disgrace.
So the people who might be very sanguine or saying, speaking of Brzezinski, others saying that peace through strength, the capitalism is winning out, the Soviet system is in disarray, socialist systems are in disarray, and people who are celebrating, almost arrogantly in many cases, the success and the forever ongoing leadership position of the capitalist market economies are ill-advised in terms of, in your estimation, in terms of the prospects for our planet.
I think that a lot of changes, of course.
Yeah, and the arrogance is running so
I believe very strongly that the CIA's support to torture abroad, the institutionalization of torture in country after country around the world, the support to the security services that repress and murder their own people, to the death squads, this very nasty and grisly activity, along with all the other things that the CIA does abroad, the subversion of democratic institutions, the overthrow of democratically elected civilian governments and their replacement with military dictatorships of a neo-fascist stripe, all those activities proceed from our domestic system. When I was a CIA trainee, I was taught that the Soviet foreign policy, expansionism, belligerence, and so forth, was a direct product of their internal system. That is, the requirements of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to maintain a monopoly on power. Well, I think any political scientist would agree. A nation's domestic system determines its foreign policy. And if we have elite control in this country, controlled by people who come from those 2% of the families that own 54% of the wealth, then those people are defining the national security. And they're defining it in their own interests, just as the framers of the Constitution wrote the document in their own interests. And they wrote it because they wanted to have the people who own the United States govern the United States.
How do we deal with
this? We still have that situation.
And again, we talked specifics about the book. How do we deal with that kind of a situation as far as the United States is concerned in your estimation? Is the political process of trying to find a meaningful reform or transformation through the mainline political parties, or how do we do it? Do we need political leadership, or what is the path that you could see?
Well, of course, I see the Rainbow Coalition, that movement, as very, very positive because it is widening the political debate. It is bringing concepts such as economic violence into the mainstream, whereas up until now these concepts were fringe practically. And so I think that that's an extremely important movement. And when I see the weakening of the CIA as a very important element, I see it as an element which will help liberate other people, because the struggle of the people of Nicaragua is our struggle. Every victory of the Nicaraguans, the Cubans also, is our victory, because that weakens the imperial project begun more than 200 years ago. And it means our own changes and liberation in this country are that much easier. That's why it's very important to be in solidarity and to work with those people.
It's a little bit difficult for Americans to be able to start thinking about, if you say liberation movements of people, third world peoples and so forth, what they're going to liberate themselves from in many, many instances is the hegemony of the United States of America.
Absolutely.
And the United States of America becomes the bastion of conservative reactionary power, or in other words, in a certain sense, the enemy in the minds of increasing numbers of people, particularly in the developing world. They have that view of the United States. That's something that's a very little hard for Americans to swallow when they like to think about this as being the fount of wisdom and all good things in this world.
Well,
if you understand what I'm saying.
Absolutely, and the symbolism is in the flag, as if we're one nation, undivided, with liberty and justice for all. Whereas in actual fact, that symbolism covers what is basically a fractured society. And when you speak of the United States, in the interest of the United States, it's not all the people of the United States. It's those very few who run and control the United States. These activities of the CIA abroad, which I've been discussing, are in the interests of those few people. The CIA, when it supports death squads, is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, because the CIA doesn't have its own policy. It is told what to do by the President of the United States. It's his instrument, and he uses it as he wishes. Of course, he tries to deny certain things and keep a distance, like Reagan did, from all of the Oliver North stuff. But in actual fact, the CIA does not have its own policy. And for that reason, it is told to do things that are in the interest of not the vast majority of Americans, not yours, not mine, but in the interest of just a few people whose wealth is based on the operations of American companies in countries around the world. So when Brzezinski or someone else talks about America, that is a typical figure of speech used to make it look as if we all have common interest. When in actual fact we don't at all. There is no way you can define national security in this country which would be in the interest of all the people. That's why it's so important to think in terms of breaking the imperial project begun a long time ago, that is as it's manifested abroad, and also within the United States to create a real democracy, a government which serves the interests of all the people and not just the priorities of very few.
Each person can have a vote in this country where they can vote in an election. Less than 50% do. We do it to that degree, then have in a certain sense a political democracy, in that there are these party systems allowed and so forth. Economically, we're very much of a plutocracy. I mean, the ownership, as you point out, 5% owning 54, 2% owning 54%, and 5% virtually perhaps owning it all. Most people only have a wage relationship to production and so forth. Gives us a problem in terms of that broad perspective of how we can see some sort of a transformation. But we have this kind of a situation now, and one wonders how are, in your estimation, you have 60 to 65% of the population vote Mr. Reagan, who was in a very real sense reactionary, both domestic and on an international scale, most popular president to leave the presidency in these many decades. And how do we explain the fact that there are so many people who are in support of him and what was going on, even though it was acting against the interests of many of the people of our country and the world? I mean, is it a matter of the media? Is it a matter of... Do you understand?
Well, yes, well, I'll give you an example. This illustrates the problem and the solution. A recent poll a few months ago was taken on Americans' attitudes toward El Salvador, toward the government of El Salvador. And you know, this is the Duarte government. It's the one that's received $3.5 billion, $1.5 million a day, which exceeds the national budget. It has been heralded from years now as the showcase of the restoration of what they call democracy in Central America. Americans ought to know something about the government of El Salvador. All right, what is the result? 15% only. 15% of Americans, according to the poll, which was taken by a professional pollster organization in Detroit, only 15% of Americans believe that El Salvador has a democratic government. 33% of Americans, according to the poll, don't have the slightest idea what kind of government El Salvador has. But then the revelation, 35% of Americans think that El Salvador has a pro-Soviet government.
Good Lord.
Now, they didn't say what the other 17% thought, but it doesn't surprise me if they have Duarte confused with Khomeini and think that there's a Islamic fundamentalist government in El Salvador. It's ignorance, it's apathy, it's lack of interest, really, that keeps Americans badly informed.
It's becoming worse. Becoming worse.
Yeah, well, of course, it's in schools. Every survey of Americans' ability in mathematics and geography and you name it, practically, it's shocking, because I'm over in Europe where people are really being educated, and where children, that is, young people, are paid to go to university. They don't have to mortgage the farm to go to university. They get a stipend from the government because those governments realize that the future is in the youth. And they should be given every opportunity to have an education.
And here we do not. And they have the self-serving kind of thing, and the United States is going in this direction. You're also in touch from Spain, and you were in Spain partly because it was a little bit difficult for you to be here. People thought you were subversive or something of that sort of thing, but you had to, I mean, people in the government were seeing you for having...
Well, it's a long...
You had some difficulty.
Yeah, it's a very long story. I had terrible difficulties. It's in this book, in fact.
Right, let's let people know that right now. Maybe you could come in tight. Let's show that. Phillip Agee. This is the latest one. It's called On the Run. It's just out now. Lyle Stewart.
It came out a year and a half ago, yes.
Okay, yeah, so you've got that in there, this thing about your...
That's the whole story of the last 20 years of my life since I left the CIA. It's a whole series of adventure stories about how they followed me around in the streets. The CIA knew I was writing my first book. It was the early 70s. They followed me around in the streets, these teams of people in Paris and in London and Madrid, and I went underground in Paris. A couple of young Americans befriended me, and they gave me money when I had no money for food. I was destitute, trying to get the book done. They gave me a typewriter when I had no typewriter to work with. And it turned out that by chance I discovered inside the typewriter a radio transmitter secretly hidden in the case of the typewriter, which allowed CIA people to locate the secret place I was living underground. And I caught the monitors the minute they caught me. It was a very emotional scene.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah.
And then I went on to finish my book, and it also includes the stories about how I was expelled from Britain, how I was jailed and put in prison in Germany, and then expelled, kidnapped in France, and expelled from Holland, from Italy, not allowed to enter Norway. I mean, it was just going on for several years.
Sorry you had to go through all of that.
Well,
you know,
I expected retaliation.
Because you had been saying some things about the CIA and the system of American
we're driving them crazy.
That,
not just I mean, they always like to focus on me, but in fact there's hundreds of people involved. Well, John eventually came along in this anti-CIA campaign, and there were journalists of every sort all over Europe, and in fact all over the world, who were working on exposing the CIA in their own countries. That is, the operations and the people that do it, because those are the two factors that are most important in weakening the CIA as an instrument for political repression or for subversion of democratic institutions.
It's in our interest to try and weaken the instruments of our foreign policy in a certain sense.
Well, the policy hasn't changed. Policy has been the same since Truman. And if there were justice in this world, Truman and every president since him would be in prison or would have ended up behind bars. Because Article 6, I think it is, of the Constitution says that treaties will be the supreme law of the land when signed by the President and ratified by the Senate. And we have violated treaties constantly every single day since 1947. And so that alone, not to mention a lot of other things, should have brought these presidents behind bars. And Reagan himself should very well have been impeached because of the Iran-Contra affair. But the powers that be in this country did not want another constitutional crisis or a crisis of legitimacy that calls into question the whole system.
Yeah, one wonders if they're able to just do that so cavalierly without there being, I mean, the North trial is on now, and whether or not the whole story is written on that, one wonders if there is likely to be any any action brought against, or any involvement of Mr. Reagan, Mr. Bush, or any of the others who might have been involved with drug smuggling and all kinds of things that were coming out of Central America.
It's incredible. It's incredible. You know, we've had some criminals in the White House, but they became criminals after they got in. This one is a criminal before he even got into the White House. And you know why?
Mr. Bush.
Yes. The reason is that an illegal Contra resupply operation at a time when the Congress had called off the money, and it was that was financed by the cocaine barons of Colombia, was run out of Bush's office during 1983, 84, and 85.
That's established and clear and
of course, it's been in all the newspapers.
Now, how can something like that go on without there being? I mean, what are we to think when something like that could go on and the man still serves in the office?
Because nobody wants another crisis like they had with Nixon and Watergate. An impeachment process just makes the ruling elite in this country quake because it brings the system into question and the legitimacy, I mean. And we have rules of the game in this country, political rules of the game, established by the Constitution, which keep the debate very narrow. And the Constitution, these rules, are very hard to change. What it does, really, is create the situation in when we go out and vote Republican or Democratic, we are basically making a choice between, on the one hand, Tweedledee, and on the other, Tweedledum. Because you can imagine a much different scheme of government which would serve people where you wouldn't have homeless, you wouldn't have illiterate, you wouldn't have people who are hungry. We have the means to create that society, but under these rules of the game, we can't do it.
Under the
it
rules
doesn't happen.
We have not only our own society, but the world in a very real sense. I was asking before, you're in Spain, and the vision of the United States of America among the peoples, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, is the vision of the United States of America is in decline in the minds of the masses of the people?
No, there's a distinction in anybody who's politically aware, in his mind or her mind, between the government and the people who run the United States, the economic forces behind the government, and the people of the United States. I have had the most marvelous reception everywhere I've gone, from ordinary people, because they know that I am not part of that ruling elite or clique, not part of political repression anymore, that kind of thing. So my receptions have been fantastic, and people know that there is a difference. They know that there are Americans at work every day in this country to try to change the system, to work in solidarity with the people of El Salvador, or with Nicaragua, or with Cuba, or with Grenada, even now, but much more so before the collapse of the revolution there, and with peoples all over the world who are trying to change the system. They are trying to break the control of generations of these so-called 14 families in El Salvador, or the oligarchies elsewhere in America.
The oligarchies of the world.
Of the world. Yeah. But we have to do that here, too. We could take a lesson from them, and one of the points I try to make to all the students I talk to is that they should look to the students of El Salvador right now for an example, because those students of El Salvador are going out on the streets constantly. They are laying their life on the line every day for what they believe in, to create a just and better society for everybody, just as the Nicaraguans have created a revolution in the name of the poor of that country and the oppressed.
I guess what I was saying, the masses of the people of the world are less inclined towards seeing the United States in favorable terms than they have. We're losing ground among the masses of the people of the world, the United States of America, the official capacity of representation of the United States of America.
That's right, because people see that it's true, the official acceptance, or let's say the acceptance of official policies in the United States, meaning whatever comes out of the government, is certainly in decline, absolutely, all over the place. But people there know, they know perfectly well that there is a whole movement going on in this country for change, and it may be weak, it may be small, it may not be as strong now as the one issue like end of the Vietnam War, that kind of thing, but that there are Americans working on it, and so America is basically admired and loved by people all over the world for the popular culture, for example, for the diversity, for the spontaneity, for the civil liberties, for things like that. But what they don't like are nuclear weapons, militarism, trying to crush one of the poorest countries in the world, Nicaragua.
Terrorist CIA activity?
Absolutely. That is what turns more people against the United States than you can imagine.
And more people ought to understand that that's the position that we have. We really do need some sort of a philosophy, political philosophy or vision that allows us to relate to the needs of underclass, poor people of the, not only of the world, but also of our nation. I mean, we have streets filled with homeless and that sort of thing. We really do need that, that does not seem to come out of the mainstream political, the political dialogue.
We try to
vision
neutralize
that relates to that need on a third, and that's part of a national strength, as it were, in terms of in the most realpolitik kind of terms. We do need that kind of vision, and we lack it. I mean, the United States of America does in its tradition.
Our problem is that elitist view that we've been talking about. But what we do in the United States is we allow, or officially we allow these people to be neutralized so that they're not a political threat. There was no demand for crack in 1980-81 because there was no such thing as crack practically. This was invented, and the demand was invented. You hear this talk about stopping the demand side rather than the source side. Well, in actual fact, this crack epidemic in the United States right now raises some interesting questions. For example, isn't there some kind of political dividend that for every ghetto youth who gets on crack or gets addicted to some other drug is one potential political activist less who has everything to gain by radical change in this country? This is a whole generation. There are millions of kids who are being turned on to crack and off to politics.
Yeah, and particularly when you see that the government at the highest levels have been involved in the bringing of drugs into this country knowingly. It makes it just seem almost a question that the realities of the situation have to be called into question, and it seems to me, if I may, your work and your books and your activity and so forth has been one of the leading people who are bringing us a new kind of vision, a different kind of vision. You did it at considerable personal discomfort to yourself and so forth, and I want to just thank you personally for all your work over the years and so forth. And of course the book, let me show it once again, On the Run, Phillip Agee, and it's 5 books now that you've written over the longer haul, and he keeps working on these issues, and it's been your pleasure. I want to thank you for that, and particularly for participating in conversations here.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Interesting series that we've got, interesting conference that we have here. What is it? The Socialist Scholars Conference here in New York City, where we are now talking, and I want to again thank you very much, Phillip Agee, for participating.
Well, I'm very happy to be with you.
Okay, fine. It's your pleasure, if I could say. Then it, of course, been Phillip Agee, your pleasure to have these perceptions. We'll be doing more next week from this conference at the at the Socialist Scholars Conference in New York. That's it for this particular segment. We'll see you again next week. Philip, once again, thank you very much indeed. Good night. We'll see you next week.
Stopping the demand side rather than the source side. Well, in actual fact, this crack epidemic in the United States right now raises some interesting questions. For example, isn't there some kind of political dividend that for every ghetto youth who gets on crack or gets addicted to some other drug is one potential political activist less who has everything to gain by radical change in this country? This is a whole generation. There are millions of kids who are being turned on to crack and off to politics.
Yeah, and particularly when you see that the government at the highest levels have been involved in the bringing of drugs into this country knowingly. It makes it just seem almost a question that the realities of the situation have to be called into question, and it seems to me, if I may, your work and your books and your activity and so forth has been one of the leading people who are bringing us a new kind of vision, a different kind of vision. You did it at considerable personal discomfort to yourself and so forth, and I want to just thank you personally for all your work over the years and so forth. And of course the book, let me show it once again, On the Run, Phillip Agee, and it's 5 books now that you've written over the longer haul, and he keeps working on these issues, and it's been your pleasure. I want to thank you for that, and particularly for participating in conversations here.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Interesting series that we've got, interesting conference that we have here. What is it? The Socialist Scholars Conference here in New York City, where we are now talking, and I want to again thank you very much, Phillip Agee, for participating.
Well, I'm very happy to be with you.
Okay, fine. It's your pleasure, if I could say, then it, of course, been Phillip Agee, your pleasure to have these perceptions. We'll be doing more next week from this conference at the Socialist Scholars Conference in New York. That's it for this particular segment. We'll see you again next week. Phillip, once again, thank you very much indeed. Good night. We'll see you next week. Okay.